So we've been looking at the 6 different elements of organizational structure: work specialization, departmentalization, chain of command, span of control, centralization, and formalization. So if we combine these 6, we can find the 2 extremes. We'll call one the mechanistic organization. So it is rigid and tightly controlled. Highly specialized, rigid departments. The departments don't interact with each other, so more siloed approach. Clear chain of command, more centralized in decision making, so higher up in the organization and in the org chart is where the decisions are made, and the span of control is narrow. Highly formalized in terms of the rules and procedures. On the other side, we have an organic organization. So this one is much more adaptive, much more collaborative. So it doesn't have that hierarchy, doesn't have that high specialization. It's teams working together. So it is more informal communication. It's more decentralized. There's less rules and procedures, and people are more flexible in terms of what is done and done by whom. So those are the 2 extremes. Okay. So as we look at, are we more of a mechanistic organization? Are we more of an organic organization? We can look at a number of considerations. So what kind of strategy do we have as an organization? So when you think mechanistic, think about the traditional manufacturing assembly line type production. That's a mechanistic. So really the focus in terms of strategy for a mechanistic organization is about cost cutting, cost control. If you are a startup, you have this new business idea, then it's probably a small team of people really focused on innovation, new products. You're going to be much more organic. You're not going to have that big, long org chart. It's going to be much more flat. Okay. So your strategy, as we saw before with McKinsey's and with Galbraith, need to align with the organizational structure. If you have a simple strategy, then you need a simple structure. That org chart doesn't need to be complicated. If you have a big organization, then you are more likely to be mechanistic in nature. The bigger you are, the more people that are involved, the more we're going to need formalization, so we have clear rules and processes, and the more we're going to need that centralization in terms of ensuring that decisions get made and that we're not making conflicting decisions because we've delegated the work and now we're duplicating all of the work. So we need clear chains of command with large organizations. How you design your production process is also going to impact that organizational structure. So in a moment, we're going to look at 4 different process designs. One is a job shop. Second is a batch production. Then we have repetitive and continuous. So if you're repetitive or continuous, that's much like the manufacturing plant, the assembly line. It is going to be more mechanistic. With the job shop and the batch, you are producing variety, which means you need to be more flexible, which is going to be more of the organic style. So remember, organic was more collaborative, less formal, less structured, more decentralized in its structure. Before we get into that process design though, the other piece here is environment. Is it stable or uncertain? We talked before, when we talked about centralization, that if the business was at risk, if the environment was threatening to the organization, there was a benefit to centralization because you could make quicker decisions. But when you combine all of these 6 elements, if the environment is more unstable and you're choosing between the 2 extremes, mechanistic and organic, even though the organic is more decentralized, you'd rather be organic than mechanistic. So mechanistic organizations, because of that rigidity of people working in silos, the highly formalized rules and processes, it's not very respondent to change. So it expects a very stable environment. That is, the demand for toothpaste is always the same amount. There's no big threats to the production of toothpaste. So we just keep our production line, our manufacturing going of our toothpaste. Very mechanistic approach. If we're looking at the innovative, if we're looking at the unstable environment where it's constantly changing in terms of what customers need, in terms of where we can produce and how we can produce is constantly changing, then you need a more responsive model, in which case the organic one is going to be much more adaptive because of the other components in the 6 elements, right? More of that informal communication, less rules and rigidity will allow it to be more responsive. So yes, centralization does allow for quicker decisions if your business is under threat. But if we're looking at organic versus mechanistic, you'd rather be organic if you're in that unstable environment because of the informalness in that piece there. All right, so we talked about how we could choose an organizational structure based on our strategy. This actually comes from Alfred Chandler. He's the one who did the work in terms of corporate structure being defined. Woo! My button got stuck and just went through all the slides. He's the one that talked about how corporate structure is defined by the strategy. We talked about the size of the organization. Small and nimble is more organic. Large is going to be more mechanistic. We talked about environment. Now let's dig deeper into this process design piece. So when we talk about process design, we said there was job shop, batch, repetitive, and continuous. So really when we look at these different types of processes, as I go out to find my pen, is that on one end, we have high variety and low quantity. So when we talk about a job shop, this is the custom made to order. So you order something on Etsy and they're making it just for you. High variety, low quantity. And the tools we're going to use are going to be very general tools that can do a lot of different things. On the other extreme, you have continuous, which is no variety. Everything is the same, and high quantity. So high of quantity that it becomes difficult to stop production. So if you think about, for example, the production of polyethylene, that's little plastic pellets that Dow and Nova produce. In those cases, it's just continually producing plastic pellets. It actually takes time to shut down the operation because it's a continuous process. If we don't do it properly and take time to do it, in that case, we have chunks of plastic stuck in the pipes. So 2 extremes, custom made, the other end, mass production, continually producing, everything is the same, difficult to stop. In between, we have batch. So batch is just like it sounds. We're going to make things in batches, in groups. So we could talk about an airline, right? It moves people in groups, one plane at a time. If you are manufacturing beer, your Troubled Monk here in central Alberta, then we are making it in vats. We have batches of beer. We have some variety, different flavors, but we're doing it in groups. Okay, so not as much variety as the job shop, but more quantity than the job shop. Then we have the repetitive process. So when we think about assembly lines, mass production, they're going to be repetitive or continuous. But repetitive allows for some variety. So when we think about manufacturing of cars and trucks, it is repetitive. You can have a Lariat, you can have a King Ranch edition of an F-150. We have variety. We also have large quantity. So unlike the continuous process, This one, it's easier to stop and trade out to make a different type of product. So a lariat versus the King Ranch edition. When you get to the repetitive and the continuous, the equipment that you're using becomes very specialized. It does one particular thing, and that's especially true of the continuous production process. So as we're looking at organizational structure, that more organic, responsive, less formalized structure of an organization, we see more with the job shop and the batch. When we're doing our mass production, large-scale manufacturing, remember, they're much more mechanistic, much more formalized in terms of rules and processes as we compare them. So let's take a look at these images. Can you identify whether it is job shop, batch, repetitive, or continuous? So take a moment and see if you can identify. All right, well, I think I already gave one away. The vehicle one is what? It's repetitive. What about the movie theater? Batch. What about sugar production? Continuous. And what about the florist? Job shop. So we can look at the process that we follow to make our goods and provide our services. That is going to influence the type of organizational structure that we have. In our later videos, we will look more at the process that is involved. So once you decide on a process design, the next piece, of course, will be to decide on the steps of that process. So in the coming video, we're going to look at the process flow diagram and how we can outline those steps. What you see here, this is a similar graph to what we've been looking at in terms of the job shop, would be something like an emergency room, appliance repair, low quantity, high variety. Okay, so you're competing as an organization based on variety. As we get more into batch, that would be bakeries, movie theaters, airlines, beer, more flexibility there. You might compete then based on quality. As we look at more of the repetitive, less flexibility, higher quantity, lower variety, car production, car washes, you're focusing on timeliness in terms of competing. And then we have the large scale production where it is continuous process, high quantity, low variety. Your focus in terms of competing is on cost. This might be the sugar we looked at, steel, polyethylene, water, those types of things. Large production, continually processing them as we make the good.